Greg was the kind of guy that would take you out for dinner, and then for dessert, blow your brains out.
He was probably singularly the most important informant we had at the time.
The FBI gave him a license to kill, and he became a killing machine.
But once he knew that he was dying, it was off the charts as far as his recklessness.
Gregory Scarpa was born in Brooklyn, New York on May 8, 1928.
He grew up in a neighborhood that was the breeding ground for organized crime members, and he learned from the guys that he grew up with.
At 19, Scarpa was solid, almost 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. He was the kind of muscle the wise guys could use.
When you wanted people to break knees, when the loan sharks needed somebody to make sure the cash flowed in, kids like Greg Scarpa were perfect.
One of the mobsters looking for young talent was Charlie Lo Cicero, a top capo for boss Joe Profaci, the head of one of New York's 5 major crime families. Lo Cicero called in Scarpa for a sit-down at a Bensonhurst club. The mobster liked what he saw. The 19-year-old was business smart, with muscle to back it up. On the street, his mentor Lo Cicero got what he expected. Scarpa was ambitious, a young kid who was good with numbers and better with his fists. 21-year-old Greg Scarpa officially became an associate of the Profaci crime family. His criminal education was just beginning. In the early 1950s, Greg Scarpa was making a name for himself on the hard streets of Brooklyn as an earner and enforcer for the Profaci family. At 25 years old, Greg Scarpa was a made man.
He carried himself with an air of authority and was virtually fearless, and he showed it in his demeanor and in his face.
As Scarpa's violent reputation grew, so did his earning. His truck hijackings brought in buckets of cash. But with the hijacking, Scarpa was playing a dangerous game. The FBI traced a large-scale truck hijacking back to Scarpa and his crew. Facing years behind bars, Scarpa was in a deep hole until the feds tossed him a lifeline. They would throw out his charges if he'd inform on his fellow mobsters. They'd even throw in some cash to sweeten the deal. Surprisingly, with little persuasion, he agreed.
Scarpa is believed to be the first made man in America ever to really flip and become an informer. He was pulling the strings, giving the FBI information, and getting away with murder. He was staying out of prison, making a lot of money.
He was basically allowed to operate on his own because he was such a high earner, brought in a lot of money, but also was willing to do the dirty work. He would do the hits that the family needed to have done.
Scarpa was approached by a new agent, 41-year-old Lynn De Vecchio. The agent was desperate for an education on the mob.
I'd opened the file, read everything I could find out about the man.
De Vecchio's alliance with Scarpa was a smart strategy. In the early 1980s, the feds cranked up the heat on the mafia. Armed with an anti-racketeering law known as RICO, prosecutors set their sights on the mob bosses. Suddenly, bosses were not insulated from the crimes of their soldiers. That was the case for Scarpa's family boss, Carmine Persico. With Persico incarcerated, one of his underlings, Victor Orena, looked to seize control of the family. When Carmine Persico caught wind of his plan to take over, he made a phone call.
Persico's immediate reaction was to whack him, kill him.
To get the job done, he turned to Gregory Scarpa. But as war between the Persico and Orena factions was set to ignite, Scarpa faced a bigger battle.
He just kept getting these infections, so the hospital decided to give him these tests. They came back that he had HIV.
1991, Mafia enforcer Greg Scarpa was under siege, his body battling the HIV virus, and his crime family battling a rival faction in a bloody civil war. Scarpa was directly in the crosshairs. Loyalists for Victor Orena had fired on the 63-year-old mobster as he left his home. with his daughter and grandson in tow.
They broke that oath not to involve families. Once that shooting took place, revenge was his reason for breathing at that point. He absolutely went crazy, and from that point on, he wasn't my father anymore. Like, he became a killer.
Greg Scarpa re-emerged on the street. He and his crew went hunting around Brooklyn's South Side. There were no individual contracts, just a single mission: revenge. Scarpa and his crew rolled through the neighborhood and spotted an Arena loyalist named Vinny Fusaro outside his house.
And Greg saw him. He simply took a rifle, shot him in the head, and they took off.
He and his crew would go on to take out 3 more of Arena's faction.
He loved it. It kept him going. It just kept him happy. That was the vengeance. He could go out and mow everybody from the other side down, whoever he can get, whatever they were doing, wherever they were.
Murder became Scarpa's full-time job. His crew gave him the nickname, the Grim Reaper. In mid-1992, he provided info on the wave of killings in the Colombo War, making sure not to implicate himself. But the info allowed the feds to bug the car of one of Scarpa's own crew members. Greg Scarpa had effectively snitched on himself.
He gave information on his own crew, which ultimately came back to bite him. I mean, unwittingly, he undid himself on that one.
In August of 1992, Greg Scarpa was arrested and charged with 3 murders and conspiracy to commit several more. On May 6, 1993, severely weakened by AIDS, Greg Scarpa decided to quit fighting. He pleaded guilty to 3 murders and multiple charges of conspiracy. Despite the severity of his crimes, Scarpa was sentenced to just 10 years in prison, plus a fine. On June 4, 1994, Greg Scarpa died from AIDS at a medical prison in Rochester, Minnesota.
Greg Scarpa encompassed both the best times for the mafia and the worst times.